Greetings, everyone. Peter Maravellis here on behalf of City Lights booksellers and publishers and the City Lights Foundation. I'd like to welcome you to another installment of City Lights Live, the virtual component of our events calendar, where we continue to celebrate the works of authors we know and love through readings, discussions, and forums. I'd like to take this moment at the outset to acknowledge we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral grounds of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. We would like to take this moment to offer respect to those who have come before us as stewards of the land. Tonight on City Lights Live, we are celebrating the publication of Writers and Missionaries, Essays on the Radical Imagination, published by Verso Books. We're delighted to have with us its author, Adam Shatz. He is someone whose writing we're huge fans of here at City Lights. His new book offers a close reading of the lives and works of some of the greatest intellectuals of recent times. Joining him tonight in conversation is Tammy Kim, who is a contributing writer at The New Yorker and co-host of the podcast Time to Say Goodbye. Very, very honored to have them both with us here tonight. So join us now in welcoming Adam Shatz and Tammy Kim. Welcome to City Lights. Such a pleasure.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Peter. Happy anniversary to City Lights, 70 years. It's incredible. And Adam and I are so delighted to be here. We also want to shout out Natalie at City Lights and Michel at Verso for putting this together. And thank you to all of you for making time this evening to be with us. I am so very pleased to be here with Adam Shatz, who is a beloved friend and neighbor in New York, and a writer and thinker I greatly admire and always learn so much from. If you're a reader of long-form journalism or literary criticism, you've likely encountered Adam's work before in the London Review of Books, the New York Times Magazine, the New York Review of Books, or the New Yorker, just to name a few. Tonight, we are here to celebrate and discuss Adam's first book, Writers and Missionaries, Essays on the Radical Imagination, a beautiful collection that blends reportage, criticism, and memoir, but is quite difficult to classify. Each of the 16 main chapters of this book departs from the life of a great contemporary artist or intellectual to explore the great questions of our time: empire, exile, aesthetics, race, war, belonging. Adam invites us to revisit men we think we know, such as Edward Said, Richard Wright, Roland Barthes, and he acquaints us with others with whom we may be less familiar, Fouad Ajami, perhaps, or Chester Himes. I'm very fond of the chapter on Lévi-Strauss because it was just after its publication in the London Review that Adam and I first met. The subjects of Writers and Missionaries have big, overflowing lives. They are at once models and cautionary tales, and some of them overlap in thought as protégés and mentors or foes, and in reality, crossing paths in Paris, for example. They exist on a world historical scale, yet many of them struggle. What am I doing here is a question, Adam writes, that he asks of himself as a reporter. His subjects likewise seem to be asking this of themselves. Pankaj Mishra has praised Writers and Missionaries for its cosmopolitan flair and moral urgency, and its refusal of conventional pieties. I would add only that the book, especially in its more personal chapters, reflects Adam's kindness and care. He takes his time. He sees what his subject is trying to do and be. He isn't naive, nor does he judge unfairly. I could go on, but I'll soon turn it over to Adam for a short reading so that you guys can get a taste of this wonderful collection. Then I'll ask him a few questions, and we'll save plenty of time to take your questions from the audience. So please do drop them in the chat. Peter and I will be collecting them as we go. And of course, please be sure to order this incredible book from City Lights. So here, without further delay, is my friend and the author, Adam Shatz.
Tammy, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And thanks also to City Lights Books for sponsoring this event, and to my publicist, Michel, for helping to organize it. I'm just going to read a little bit from the introduction of the book. In 1990, I arrived in New York City to attend Columbia University with a vague and yet passionately held idea of becoming a writer. A novelist, a journalist, a literary critic? I didn't know, but the uncertainty in no way dampened my hope that one day I might be known as an author of something. Imagine then my reaction when, in a class on contemporary French thought, I read Roland Barthes' 1967 essay, The Death of the Author. This is a quote. "It is language which speaks, not the author. To give a text an author is to impose a limit on that text, to furnish it with a final signified, to close the writing. The birth of the reader," Barthes went on, "must be at the cost of the death of the author." Nor was he alone, I learned, in seeing the author and his or her intentions as an obstacle to the reader's interpretation of the text, even to the reader's freedom. 2 years after Barthes' essay was published, Michel Foucault defined the author as, quote, "the principle of thrift in the proliferation of meaning, and as a figure of unearned privilege. What difference," he declared, "does it make who is speaking?" Quite a lot, you might reply. And had someone else published these obituaries, I'm not sure how much attention I would have paid them. The allure and indeed authority of Barthes and Foucault were only enhanced by their dramatic disavowals of the value of authorship. But if the author was dead, what was the point of becoming one? Wouldn't it be better for writers, above all writers on the left, as I already thought of myself, to renounce the narcissistic practice of signing their works and to become as secretive about their identities as underground revolutionaries and thereby contribute to, in Foucault's words, the subversive proliferation of meaning? I was fascinated by the program that Barthes and Foucault were proposing and by the philosophical anti-humanism they espoused. Their writings were dense and often elusive, but they were also elegant, seductively counterintuitive, and even sexy. Barthes, in particular, was a writer of rare literary gifts, an author in spite of himself. Yet I could never bring myself to join the anti-humanist club for all its temptations or contemplate with equanimity the death of the author. It mattered to me then, and matters to me still, that Frederick Douglass published his autobiographies under his own name, seizing the power of authorship in a society where the enslaved were forbidden to read. That Antonio Gramsci's notes and letters had been written in one of Mussolini's jails also struck me as proof that authorship could be liberating. You could imprison the man, but not his mind. Knowledge of authors' lives and struggles, it seemed to me, could enhance and expand rather than limit our understanding of their work. As Jean-Paul Sartre reminded us in his 1948 essay, What is Literature? Writers are alive before they are dead. I agreed with Sartre, even though admitting this to some of my more theoretical peers would have been like confessing to a love of Brahms at the Darmstadt School of Experimental Music. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Adam. That was great. I forgot to hold up this book, which is so beautiful and so well designed. As you can see, this title, Writers and Missionaries, Adam, I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about what it means, because there's also a chapter in the book called Writers or Missionaries.
Sure.
So what are the concepts that you're trying to get across?
Sure. The title is drawn from that essay, which was a lecture that I gave about reporting in the Middle East. And that formulation, that dichotomy between writers and missionaries, between people who describe and analyze and those who are more like advocates or evangelists for a position, came to me in the early aughts, actually shortly before 9/11, when the New York Times Magazine asked me to interview the Nobel Prize-winning author V.S. Naipaul, whom I admired as a writer, but whose politics I despised. And I spoke to him about his views on Islam. It was perhaps a month or so after the attacks, and he defended himself by saying that at a certain point you have to decide, are you a writer or a missionary? And this was his way of saying that he was merely speaking the truth about Islam rather than dressing it up in pieties and rationalizations. Now, of course, the truth is that, if anyone was a missionary when it came to the subject of Islam, it was V.S. Naipaul. He was in his late years, a Hindu nationalist and quite hostile to Islam. But at the same time, I found the formulation interesting, and it stayed with me as I was reporting in the region. I decided, however, to change the title to Writers and Missionaries because I don't see it as a hard and fast divide. I think we're always, a little bit of both, more one than the other, depending on the occasion. But it's I think a tension that anyone who writes on matters of politics and aesthetics has to confront, whenever they sit down at their desk.
Thank you. And maybe you could give us just a brief background in the selection of the pieces and the way they're organized in the book. I mentioned in the introduction that there are 16 primary chapters, and the subheadings are very interesting: Native Sons, Equal in Paris, Signs Taken for Wonders, and Lessons of Darkness. Tell us a little bit about those.
Sure. Most of these essays, I should say at the outset, were pieces that were commissioned by magazines that I write for, and were previously published in much the same form, although I did make revisions and actually published one chapter in a different form, the longest chapter in the book, which is on Richard Wright. The first section is about Arab intellectuals whose work in some way speaks to issues having to do with the Arab revolts that began in 2011, or the legacy of American empire in the region. I'm thinking of the piece about Fouad Ajami, or for that matter, the Palestine question, which is at the center of the piece on Edward Said, and also the reported piece about the assassinated actor and director, Giuliano Mer Khamis. The second section of the book is about a group of Black writers who settled in Paris in the 1940s and 50s, not including James Baldwin. Today, the best known of that group, although he wasn't at the time. And Baldwin, of course, makes an appearance in each of those pieces. He certainly leaves a trace in those pieces. But there are pieces about Richard Wright, who was who arrived in Paris in 46 and moved there with his family in 1947. Chester Himes, the great writer of noirs and pulp fiction, who was part of the Richard Wright circle at places like the Café de Tournon. And then a younger writer who was also a reporter, William Gardner Smith, who represents a kind of more radical insurgent politics. But what interested me about all of those figures is that in Paris, they began to develop a more internationalist understanding of the problem of race and the position of Black Americans, not just in America, but in a world dominated by Western imperialism. The section after that is on French writers, the French writers who took part in the various revolutions in French thought that broke out in the 1950s and 60s, structuralism and post-structuralism and what have you. And then I write about filmmakers and artists, Claude Lanzmann, the maker of Shoah, the filmmaker Jean-Pierre Melville, who was a member of the resistance, who went on to become the great director of film noir in France in the 1960s and 70s, and Sartre. And in each case, I'm writing about a specific kind of commitment in relation to situations of political emergency, whether the Nazi occupation of France, or in the case of Sartre, his visit to the Middle East just before the 1967 war. And then I kind of wrap things up with more personal reflections, my work as a reporter, and also my childhood as a chef, which in a sense is the story of my first commitment, aesthetic commitment.
Yeah, you guys should all know that Adam is a pretty extraordinary cook still, and as his reference to film indicated, a real cinephile. So you mentioned the Middle East and France, and these are geographies that recur in the book. And I think in Writers or Missionaries, you sort of explained your coming to the Middle East and your personal attachment. And in the chef essay, you sort of talk about how you came to France for the first time. But I'm curious, you as a thinker, I think, are the kind of person who, regardless of which sort of geography you had a personal attachment to, you would find these ripe ideas there and make these sorts of connections. But the Middle East and France the histories that you are plumbing in these essays, they don't seem incidental. There's something about these geographies and these particular histories that are helping you draw these connections between intellectuals and ideologies. And I'm curious if you could say a little bit about that. What is it about these regions and maybe the connection between these regions as well?
There are certainly connections between the regions in the sense that, France was one of the great empires, the second largest empire after the British Empire. And for many years, Paris was a center for intellectuals in the colonial world, including, of course, people who had been colonial subjects of France, but also exiles from the Arab world. Until recently, it was the capital of Arab exiles. Today, increasingly, it's Berlin. But in a sense, the origin of my interest, both in the Middle East and in France, lies in my childhood. I became very interested in French cooking, as I explain in the last chapter in the book, when I was about 10 years old, oddly enough. And this became a full-blown infatuation that then led me on a path towards writing, actually, and eventually to an interest in the question of France's relationship to Algeria, because it was when I was in France, the summer that I turned 16, when I was doing a stage at a restaurant in Burgundy, that I became aware that France had been this colonizer in Algeria, and that many of the people living in France today are Algerians who, trace their roots to the mother country, and not just Algerians, but also French people who either lived in Algeria as pieds noirs or who fought in the war, because over 2 million Frenchmen served in the Algerian War from 54 to 62. Now, with respect to the Middle East, I grew up in a very liberal, secular Jewish family. Neither of my parents ever went to Israel. I think I was perhaps the first member of the nuclear family to go there. So I didn't grow up in a very Zionist environment, but to grow up even in a liberal Jewish family in my generation, and I was born in 1972, was to be exposed to a certain complacent idea about Israel or the Jewish state as a sanctuary for people who had been persecuted, and you could absorb this without really examining it, without really knowing anything about how Israel came into being, or the expulsions of the Palestinian population and all that occurred in the aftermath of 1948 and 1967. And I think that what happened in my case was that I had already become quite drawn to radical politics around race, around America's meddling in Latin America, around apartheid when I was 13, 14, and so on. And then in 1987, when I was 15, the first Intifada broke out. And those images of young Palestinians throwing stones, really their only weapon, at Israeli tanks and being shot with rubber bullets, this profoundly affected me and led me to question some of the foundational myths, which in a rather lazy way I had accepted. It took me some time before I began to write about Israel-Palestine. I was involved in the issue first more as a student and as an activist. But after 9/11, I started to write pretty seriously about it, and then increasingly to travel to that part of the world.
Thank you so much. I wanted to pick up on something that you talked about in your overview of the book, which is the Black exiles in Paris section and the interesting exclusion of Baldwin. Could you talk about, you mentioned the development of internationalism and the sort of collision of ideas once they got to Paris. Some of that had to do with their perception of France's treatment of North Africans and the different sorts of multiculturalism that they encountered there. What was that experience of William Gardner Smith and Chester Himes and Richard Wright?
Sure. I mean, Gardner Smith represents, I think, a really exciting break in a certain adulatory and indulgent view of France, which frankly was quite understandable. I mean, when Richard Wright went to France, it was in 1946. He'd gone at the invitation of Claude Lévi-Strauss, actually, who was working in an ambassadorial capacity in the States at the time, and Wright had not even been able to buy an apartment in the village with his Jewish wife. They had to go to all sorts of ends to simply buy a piece of property. And this is in the North, and so, there really was no Mason-Dixon line, as I think Malcolm X said, if you were Black American. And so when Wright got to Paris, he wrote an essay, which was not published at the time, called I Choose Exile. And in that essay, he said that he experienced more freedom in a block of Paris than he did in all of the United States. And so, I think we have to remember this and understand why it is that people like Wright, and to some extent Baldwin, although Baldwin revised his own history of response to Paris, why these writers embraced France and thought they'd found themselves in heaven. It's entirely understandable. At the same time, they were forced to reckon with France's relationship to its colonies. Wright was treated rather brusquely and even shabbily by Baldwin in an essay called "Alas, Poor Richard." It's a great essay, but I think it's an unfair essay. It was published after Wright's death, and Baldwin argued that Wright had chosen a fantasy about France because it suited him. But in fact, Wright was very involved in Pan-African politics. He was one of the founders of the Negritude Journal with Aimé Césaire, Présence Africaine. He organized in 1956 the first great conference of Black writers and artists. And he also, much to his credit, I think, went to the colonial world and published 3 books on the subject. Black Power, the first one in 1953, he was in Ghana before independence. The Color Curtain, which was about a report from the Bandung Conference, and then White Man Listens. So he was certainly grappling with these issues at times in a somewhat fumbling way, but with I think real honesty and candor. Where he hesitated, however, and I think this speaks to the conditionality of the freedom that Black American intellectuals enjoyed in Paris, where he hesitated had to do with Algeria. Wright was certainly sympathetic to the Algerian independence struggle that broke out in November 1954, but he didn't say anything publicly because of a fear, and a legitimate one, that he would face expulsion from France, that he would be forced out of his sanctuary. Hymes, for his part, was much less naive, I think, about France. And Gardner Smith, of course, is the one who becomes very outspoken on the subject of Algeria and publishes this extraordinary novel called The Stone Face, which is the first novel by any writer in any language about the October 17, 1961 massacre of Algerian demonstrators by the French police, headed by the prefect, Maurice Papin, who was a war criminal in World War II. And in a sense, you can chart a generational shift. You have, Wright appearing in Paris and to some extent accepting the myth that, at least tactically. And then finally, William Gardner Smith, who represents a more insurgent generation that is very sympathetic to the Black Power revolts in America, and who sees Black Americans as, in his words, America's Algerians. So he's beginning to forge these links that in a way that is very, I think will be very familiar to people who read writers like Frantz Fanon or Angela Davis or, C.L.R. James. We see the birth of a much more internationalist perspective, which of course emphasizes the horrors of American racism, but sees it as not so much as exceptional, but as very much a part of a history of Western domination.
I have to ask, and I don't mean this to be too didactic, but do you think that there are lessons from that section from these people that you are profiling for all of us who are thinking through some of these questions of identity politics today?
Well, I mean, certainly, I mean, I think that, you know, the reason I was so attracted to Gardner Smith is that his book is a very, I think, a very subtle and sophisticated critique of identity politics, not for the sake, not on behalf of some sort of naive, colorblind ideology at all. I mean, essentially, what happens in this book, and I don't think it's too much of a spoiler, is that Simeon Brown, the protagonist, who's a journalist very much like William Gardner Smith in Paris, has found himself in this circle of Black expatriate writers, many of them modeled on the people I just mentioned, and he's very happy. And he's able to date a white woman without attracting hostile stares. He's experiencing a freedom of movement that he's never known in his life. And he's someone who was haunted by a police beating in Philadelphia, which Gardner Smith himself experienced when he was a young man. But he eventually realizes that there are other people, you know, who do not enjoy this freedom, and they are the Algerians, who are constantly menaced by identity card checks, by torture, by the camps that they've set up in Algeria and in parts of France to detain people. And his conscience is stirred, but he has to make a choice, because he could either continue to align himself with his Black writer friends who don't want to get involved, and who will say things like, "Oh, the Algerians are just white. That's just that has nothing to do with us," or he can decide to break with his Black brothers, if you will, and align himself with the people who are oppressed in France. And he makes the latter choice. And I do think that I'm not sure if it's a lesson, but I think that it's certainly a tonic, and I think challenges certain fixed essentialist ideas of racial solidarity, and emphasizes the ethical stakes in politics, which do not necessarily follow neat racial lines.
Thank you. One of the things you do really well in these profiles is get into all of the sort of grime and shine of lives and their swerves. And I think the two chapters that stuck out in that respect for me are the first on Fouad Ajami and the chapter on Claude Lanzmann. And you call Ajami's sort of early defining book, or Predicament, one of the most probing and subtle books ever written in English. But his life goes on in a sort of very different direction. And then you talk about how Lanzmann kind of becomes trapped by you know, the way you sort of metaphorically, I think, describe Shoah is very affecting. You know, he kind of becomes trapped in this sort of model or concept of his own creation. Can you talk about those two? I mean, I don't know if you would put them in parallel, but for me, that really stuck out.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, in a sense, I mean, you could argue that both, I mean, I don't want to, I mean, they're very different stories,
yes,
but both of them have a, you know, there's a conversion aspect in both of them. I mean, both of them choose a kind of belonging, which, you know, I'm questioning.
Yes.
Ajami is an interesting case because he is, you know, I mean, he passed away a few years ago, but he's a Lebanese born intellectual from the Shia community, from a community that had been historically underdogs in Lebanon. They weren't the kinds of people who ended up with the big teaching gigs. Those were usually Sunnis or Christians. He started out as a kind of youthful supporter of Nasser, and then when he got to the United States, he became you know, a sort of sophisticated left-wing critic of American power. He was close to people like Edward Said, in fact. His first book, The Arab Predicament, did I think represent a turn in some ways, because it's very much a reflection on internal Arab intellectual debates. It doesn't exclude questions of imperialism, but it's very much focused on the way that Arabs write about their own politics, their own histories, their own prerogatives, and it's a very literary work. And unfortunately, few people read it today because of how Ajami would go on to distinguish himself. He, at some point, becomes a kind of cheerleader of American policy in the region. And by the time the Second Iraq War, or third, depending on how you count, begins in 2003, he's being cited by Vice President Dick Cheney. He's being quoted as saying that, you know, American soldiers will be greeted with rice and flowers by the Iraqis. So you know, my argument in the Ajami piece rests on a number of different factors. I don't want to see him purely as a sellout. You know, I mean, I think that would be a very crude understanding of his decisions. I mean, I don't support the decisions. I think they're quite troubling. But I try to provide a more textured psychological portrait of what led him to this intellectual impasse. Now, the piece on Lanzmann is also in some sense a conversion narrative, because Lanzmann he's a French Jew who is a member of the resistance in his teens, quite a brave member. He certainly carried a gun. He was a guerrilla of a kind, if you will. And in the aftermath of the Second World War, he gravitated to the circle around temps moderne, Sartre and Beauvoir. He became Beauvoir's very young lover. He was 17 years her junior. Sartre was very much aware of this. They traveled together. And he was a fellow traveler of the left, and probably was a communist, if not a Stalinist. But then after, in large part because of his growing attachment to Israel and his identification with the Jewish state, Lanzmann gravitates from Stalinism to a no less uncritical Zionism. And it's not my argument at all that Shoah is a Zionist film. I mean, I think, you know, Shoah is an extraordinary film, and one of the and a monumental work. But there are certainly criticisms that one can make of it. And I think the criticisms that one can make of his later work are even more severe. And I'm thinking in particular of the film that he made about the Israeli army, Sahal, which is a celebration, not just of the army, but of the cult of force in Israeli political life. Lanzmann, the story of Lanzmann, I think in some ways reflects larger shifts in the French Jewish community and the emergence of what the Algerian Jewish writer Jean Daniel described in a short and very trenchant book as the Jewish prism. A certain point is through this narrow, this ethno-national prism that Lanzmann sees the world, understands the politics of France and of course the Middle East. And you know, my argument in that piece is that it leads to a very impoverished vision.
Let me ask you about another controversial figure from the book, Michel Houellebecq, the French novelist.
Right. No,
you talk about.
I seem to choose all of these, you know, morally attractive figures.
Yeah, exactly. And people who maybe in the beginning were fine, and at some point, anyway. This is sort of a review, but obviously a sort of intellectual profile of Michel Houellebecq through the book's submission. I love the first sentence of this chapter. Michel Houellebecq's novel about a Muslim takeover of France is a melancholy tribute to the pleasure of surrender. So who is Michel Houellebecq, and why did you want to write about him and include him in this book?
Right. I mean, you know, I make no apologies for Houellebecq, because he's pretty wretched, and I think probably has been so all along. But he is. There's no doubting his talent as a writer, and particularly the way that he chronicles French bourgeois life. He's caustic, he's funny, his novels are very, very well observed. I mean, if you want to get a sense of the surfaces of French life in, you know, the 1990s and aughts, you could do worse than reading some of Houellebecq's novels. Now, the reason that I chose to write about him at that time is that his book was published, I think, on the day of, or maybe the day after, the Charlie Hebdo attacks. And so it was, quite remarkable that a book envisioning, the takeover of France by an Islamist party could have been published at the time of those attacks. And of course, because of that, it was widely understood to be an Islamophobic book. Another reason, of course, is that Houllebecq himself had made all manner of repellent remarks about Islam as a religion, and he'd even invented this story that his mother, I didn't know this at the time, it's actually a fiction, that his mother, a soixante-huitard, a kind of 60s hedonist, had converted to Islam and even wore the hijab and so on. This story was a complete fiction. So in a sense, it was an irresistible topic, and I think it became a more fascinating topic for me when I actually read the novel and realized this actually isn't an attack on Islam. I'm not saying that I'm not defending Houellebecq, or certainly not his politics, but the novel's much more interesting than that. And it really is in the tradition of French novels that have used Islam to investigate and make light of France, particularly of French decadence. Why is there this pleasure in surrender in this novel? It's because the French are tired. They're unimaginative. They have no political alternatives to put forward. And by contrast, the Islam represented by this Tunisian French politician, the son of a grocer or a pharmacist, I can't remember. The Islam that he's promoting seems quite dynamic. It has lots of support from the Gulf countries. It has a project. Where is the project in France? There is none. And so as you read the book, it's told as the kind of discovery on the part of the hero, who's a French academic, that this takeover actually has been happening for years, and that all of these reputable French intellectuals have secretly converted to Islam, recognizing it as a superior force. Now, so I thought that the book would offer me an opportunity to talk about Houellebecq, to talk about the whole issue of French Islamophobia, which is real, which is extremely deep, and which I've written about elsewhere. This is one of a number of pieces in this book that were inspired, in a sense, by political events that were happening simultaneously, but which are either only mentioned glancingly or not mentioned at all. I'm usually thinking about, when I'm writing a literary essay, I'm usually thinking about some political backdrop. I mean, we were talking earlier about the question of identity politics. There's no doubt that my attraction to writers like Gardner Smith, or for that matter, Richard Wright, or Edward Said, in fact, was motivated partly by some of the discursive shifts that we've seen in American politics around issues of identity, language, and so forth.
Definitely. And for those of you in the audience who may not know, Adam has also written wonderful, very sort of timely newsy pieces as well in LRB that are very much sort of pegged to the moment of different things that we're experiencing, including the George Floyd protests in 2020. We should also, you mentioned Fanon a couple of times. We should let people know, and I think it was in the chat as well, that Adam has a wonderful book about Fanon coming out next year, and very relevant to a question from the audience. He also has an edited volume about music coming out in the near future. So Peter, I think, is going to return, and we would like to take some audience questions. We're going to start with this question I referenced from Aaron Cohen about music. Peter, do you want to read that for us?
Yeah, so good to see Adam in the audience. He eagerly awaits Adam's writing on music, but meanwhile, he asks, have Adam's thoughts on music informed the way he thinks about the authors he describes in Writers and Missionaries?
It's a great question. And I think he's right. I think there is a relationship between the music essays and the essays that I have published on writers. In my music essays, I'm in some ways approaching the musicians that I write about as thinkers. And although I wouldn't say that I'm approaching these writers as musicians, as it were, I am very interested in what could be called, I mean, in French, the term would be une petite musique, a little music, some kind of, I'm interested in, the texture of their voices. I'm as interested in formal questions as I am in questions of politics and ideas. And a friend of mine said of a writer that asked Susan Sontag that she was an aesthete among moralists and a moralist among aesthetes. And I'm not comparing myself to Sontag, but I relate to that statement intensely.
Yeah. When you guys order this book, you'll also see in the acknowledgements that Adam has a long list of musicians that he's inspired by. So I think to Erin's point, I think Adam is someone who's sort of always thinking about music. As we wait for more audience questions, I'll ask a couple more, and maybe you have some more, Peter, as well. Adam, I was curious about a little bit of a question of form about, this book being this collection of profiles, but obviously with each person connected to an idea. Can you talk about your approach to sort of biography? Because I think, like, especially since you've written the Fanon book, each of these pieces has this great combination of, sort of enough background to get the reader sort of settled, background on also the work of art or the piece of writing that this person has produced. But obviously, most of it is kind of then zooming out into the world of ideas. And I think you mentioned this also in the book a little bit, but I think like in terms of the way that we do literary education or other sorts of analysis these days, it's very sort of biographically centered. So I'm curious if you could talk about that as yourself. How have you evolved in your approach to biography as an essayist, as an author? What should the place of biography be as we're sort of trying to navigate these intellectual ideas?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a really good question. I came of age in an era in which there was no more degraded form of criticism than biographical criticism. I think it was regarded as almost contemptible. I mean, the last thing you were supposed to do was to I won't even say reduce, even to relate a person's work to their life. The life was really not relevant. The work was the work was on the page, and you're probably familiar with Derrida's remark that there is no outside text. There's nothing hors de text. Now, as I explained in the introduction to this book that I read earlier, I was never entirely convinced by this. I mean, I do think that the life struggles of writers and artists really matter. Bringing something into being is no simple matter. There's a story there. The story does not entirely account for the content of the work, the shape of the work, its contours. And I think that if anything, there's been a kind of overcorrection, certainly in popular culture, which sometimes would have us believe that the biography is all that matters, and that the work is almost a supplement to the biography. And as I think I say in the introduction, that this idea that somehow that art is created out of trauma, the way that butter is whipped out of cream. I mean, this is certainly not true. I mean, given that so many of the figures that I'm writing about were actually engaged as public figures in important political questions of their day, having to do with the Cold War and decolonization, civil rights, the memory of the Holocaust, the Palestinian struggle for liberation, and so on, I couldn't not write about their stories. But as you'll see in a piece like the essay on Edward Said, ultimately what interests me about Said is less the explicit positions that he held. I'm not looking to him as some kind of model whom we must follow. What interests me is what he did with this inheritance. How he created this ideology or this structure of feeling that he at one point called Palestinianism, and how his relationship to music figured in his understanding of contrapuntal criticism. So, I think that, to put it very crudely, I'm interested in a biographical criticism that is dialectical and that is alive to form, and that understands that, people, when they create art, when they compose music, when they write books, they're engaging in a creative act. It can't simply be gleaned from whatever experiences they've had.
Thank you. Peter?
Yeah, I've got it's a personal question about narrative structure. And then when you're writing in English or reading in English or then reading in French, have you noticed psychological shifts? Have you noticed, the way that you're perceiving and anything that might happen in the interim going between one language and another?
Well, there's no question that the experience of reading another language is different from the experience of reading it in translation, and that you become, I don't want to say that you become another person, but you experience yourself very differently in another language. I mean, of course, when you first start to speak another language, you experience yourself once again as a child, right? It's that very embarrassing experience of learning a language and being limited in the extent to which you can express yourself, and being forced to use, all manner of very simplistic phrases. But I think that there's no question that my relationship to the French language, which comes through, reading, through travel, and through friendships with people with whom I really don't speak English, that this, has really deeply informed the writing that I do on French subjects, and I think it's also shaped my intellectual outlook in many ways, and possibly my understanding of form as well. I've never really, although there are certainly writers in the Anglo-American tradition whom I deeply admire, there are many. I do feel an affinity with French critics that might be a bit deeper. So yes.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. Aaron has another question. Along with Jean-Pierre Melville, were there other non-documentary filmmakers you considered featuring in Writers and Missionaries? And what makes Melville such a standout figure that he would be included in the book?
Well, I do think that for me, Melville is one of the great visionaries of cinema. I mean, if cinema is a dream, then he really is one of the great dreamers. I mean, he comes up with a whole grammar that is almost unprecedented. I remember Melville once said, when his films were described as Bersonian, in other words, as reminiscent of the work of the great Catholic filmmaker Robert Bresson, he replied by saying, "No, it's Bresson who is Melvillian." Now, and if you look at the dates of his films, his first film, The Silence of the Sea, Silence de la Mer, came out in, I think, 1947. There's an argument there, and I think that, going back to Aaron's question about music, there is an aura and a mesmerizing quality to Melville's work that has always, really moved me. And then, of course, there is Melville's story. Melville is not his real name. It's Jean-Pierre Melville. He's a French Jew who joins the resistance under the pseudonym, a tribute to his favorite author, Herman Melville. And his films, even the crime films, films like Le Samouraï and Le Doulos and the Red Circle, these films about crime are very much permeated with his wartime imagination, with his understanding of what he called, the army of shadows, the wartime underground. And so, to me, Melville fit into this book because he's someone who commits himself early on to the resistance against fascism, and then becomes this irascible, brilliant, hermetic, and stubborn filmmaker who, although he's known as, the father of the new wave, is really a very solitary figure. And that's true of a lot of people in this book. A lot of people in this book are very solitary. They stick to their visions. They're sometimes quite difficult and prickly, and Melville certainly was. Now, yes, are there other French filmmakers who could have fit into this book? There are, and I, hope to get to them eventually. I mean, I'm, very passionate about, certainly about filmmakers like Godard and Maurice Pialat, Agnès Varda. There are many. I mean, I could go on, but at the time, I was drawn to Melville, and found that there was a story that really hadn't been properly told.
Mm.
So NB says, Adam mentioned that many of these pieces are the result of commissions in constructing this collection of essays into a book. Did he consider including non-male identified authors?
It's a good question. I mean, the fact that, I have written, there's only there, and it's true, and I address this in the introduction, there's only one woman who is the subject of a chapter, and that's Arwa Saleh, who is a very brilliant Egyptian writer who was part of a Marxist Leninist group, and then who, in her disillusionment, wrote this fascinating critique of her comrades before committing suicide in the 1990s, and it's an extraordinary book. I have written about a number of women intellectuals and artists like Adrienne Piper and Nina Simone and others, but for one thing, they did not fit into the categories that I chose for this book, and some of those essays will appear in a subsequent volume, certainly in my jazz book. And the person who asked the question is right. I mean, as I said, they were commissions, and most of the commissions I was getting from the London Review of Books were for writers who were male. And I'd be the first to admit that in a very different kind of book could be written with a list of predominantly women intellectuals. And so I don't seek to defend it. It's a fact, and therein lies the limitation. On the other hand, the question of gender is very much a part of this book. If you read the essays on Alain Robbe-Grillet or Jean-Pierre Melville, or certainly Chester Himes, I write extensively not just about female writers, including Beauvoir and Patricia Highsmith and others, but I write about issues of male violence and chauvinism and what today would be called toxic male behavior. So I would say that the individual chapters are informed by a lively interest in feminism, even though the subjects are male.
There are editors in the audience. We are counting on you to commission more pieces about non-male identified authors. I think we're going to wrap up pretty soon. I might ask one last question, and if the audience has anything more, please chime in. Adam, I just want to return to what we started with, which is this question of writers and missionaries, or writers or missionaries. In discussions we've had, we talk about this struggle of having political commitments, wanting the world and ideas to sort of go in a certain direction, but not necessarily wanting to just be a sort of cheerleader or propagandist in our work. But sometimes it feels like it's very important to win, and so I'm curious if you wanted to give an example or elaborate on that a little bit. What is the role right now of a public intellectual or a writer with political commitments, with desire for the world to be a certain way?
Sure. I mean, I don't think that it's a choice really between advocacy and an analytic description, and I think that by being faithful to your understanding of the world and its complexity, you can also be an advocate. I mean, I frankly, I think that the example of the person who's interviewing me is a striking one. I mean, Tammy is someone who consistently publishes pieces that enlighten and inform, even as they point to other alternatives, to suppressed alternatives, and to popular struggles, and to the stakes for justice. It is possible. People do it, and I try to do it as well. So I don't think that the choice is ever between cheerleading and being some kind of cool-headed analyst. At the same time, I've just found in my own case that that coolness and dispassion can sometimes be your most effective instruments of critique. I may experience outrage, but I don't think outrage is very interesting on the page. And so if I'm writing about, except in a novel it can be actually a novel maybe recounting someone's a temper tantrum or wild dream, but it's not interesting on the page in criticism. And so if I'm writing about let's say a racial atrocity in the States, or if I'm writing about Israel's latest military raids in the West Bank or in Lebanon or in Gaza, sometimes just describing what happens and providing an account that is deeper and more historical and more grounded in sources of information that are seldom disclosed in the mainstream press will be more effective than expressing horror. I think horror speaks for itself.
Thank you so much for that.
Sure.
I think we can end on that note of counsel, and thank you so much, Adam. This has been such a pleasure. Everyone, please, again, do order this fantastic book. You'll learn so much, and the writing is so beautiful, and it's so accessible to all of us. Peter, thank you so much for having us tonight, and thank you all for making time this evening. It was great.
Thank you so much. It was terrific. Thanks so much.